Okay, can everybody hear me? I'm not used to these microphones. I don't know how close I need to be. Is that good?
That's good.
Okay. So I'm here talking about cryptography. In particular, I'm going to try to tell you everything you need to know in 1 hour. This talk originally originated out of a discussion on Hacker News about 5 years ago. I was sort of arguing with Thomas Tacek. He often takes a position on Hacker News that developers should not know anything about cryptography. You should just use other people's code. Trying to teach you about cryptography is dangerous because if you know a little bit, you will try to do a lot and you'll get a lot wrong. So I told him, well, I think there's really only about an hour worth of material that people really need to know. He laughed at this. I said, right, I'm going to write this talk and I will give it at a conference. So you see the date on here, May 13th, 2010. That's when I first gave this talk at a conference in Ottawa, BSDCan, which I go to every year. I was reviewing my slides a few days ago and I decided there was absolutely nothing I needed to change. So 4 years of cryptographic breakthroughs haven't actually changed anything in terms of my recommendations here. Which I guess says that they are good recommendations. So why am I giving this talk aside from wanting to prove a point? Well, a lot of people get cryptography wrong. Google Kezar had a problem. Again, these examples are from 4 or 5 years ago when I first wrote these slides. They had a problem with checking of signatures on packets. They had a timing side channel. SSL, shortly before I wrote these slides, had a problem with session renegotiation. There's actually a problem not in any implementations, but actually in the SSL protocol. You could take 2 SSL connections and sort of splice them together, which meant you could connect to a server, send some data, and then splice somebody else's connection into there, and depending on what the server was doing, if it could echo data back to you, you could steal people's cookies, things like that. Amazon, in the first Amazon Web Services signing method, retroactively named method number 1, they had a problem with the way they generated signatures. You could have 2 different messages which were reduced to the same string of bytes and then produced the same signature. Flickr, of course, we all know about Flickr here in Vancouver. They in fact had a very similar bug to what Amazon did, with the added problem that they used MD5 rather than an actual signature scheme. Intel hyperthreading. This was a problem I found back in 2005, and Intel got very annoyed with me for publishing it. If you were running on one thread of a hyperthreaded core, and somebody else was running on the other thread, you could steal information about what they were doing by looking at how their activities affected the contents of the L1 cache. In particular, when they loaded data into the L1 cache, it would bump some of your data out. You could measure whether your data was in the cache by measuring how long it took for you to read your own data, and you could steal RSA keys like this. Minor issue, right? In fact, a few weeks after I published this, a team out of Israel with Shamir and a couple of his grad students, that's Shamir as in RSA, published the same vulnerability except that they demonstrated it with AES. And then pretty much every single phone encryption protocol that has ever been created is broken for a variety of different reasons. Now, there's really 3 reasons why people get cryptography wrong. The first is they're just idiots. Those first 2 issues there, the timing side channel and the session renegotiation, any competent cryptographer looking at it, in fact, you didn't even really need to be a cryptographer. A generalist developer who understood C code could look at it and say, but this is not going to work, and here's the very simple reason why. Session renegotiation is generally just a bad idea for crypto protocols. And the timing side channel I'll talk about later on in the talk. Using the wrong tools. in the case of the Flickr attack, they used MD5, which is a hash function, but what they actually wanted was a symmetric signature function, a message authentication code. If they had used HMAC MD5 instead of using MD5, then they would have had, well, they would have had one problem instead of two. The second problem, as I mentioned before, which Amazon also had, was that you could have two different messages which came down to the same string of lines they were signing. So you need to, if you're going to sign a message, you need to actually make sure that you're signing one message and your signature is valid for other messages as well. And then the other issue is dealing with unusual environments. When I raised the hyperthreading issue with Intel, they came back to me and said, but nobody would actually have somebody they don't know running code on the same computer, would they? I guess virtualization wasn't a big deal back in 2005, but even anybody who's familiar with Unix time-sharing systems, I mean, Unix has been doing this for 30 years, even before that point. But Intel didn't think that this was really an environment that they needed to worry about. So, yeah, they were probably aware that they could leak information between threads on the same CPU, or they didn't really think it was a problem. At least that's the charitable interpretation. The uncharitable interpretation is that they've got some people who work for them who used to work for the NSA. So, the conventional wisdom for cryptography is just don't do it. You should use SSL for transport. You may have heard some comments I've made about SSL in the past few years. You should use GPG for protecting data at rest. Thomas Tachek said if you're writing the letters AES into your code, you are doing it wrong. Well, that's one way of looking at it. The way I see it, you're probably going to be writing crypto code no matter what I do, so you might as well do it right. The fact that all of you came out to hear a talk about cryptography suggests to me that you actually care about cryptography. You're quite likely going to be doing something with cryptography at some point in the future. And the other important thing here is most applications only need a very small set of well-understood primitives. There's a whole bunch of stuff out there in cryptography that, yeah, it's great if you're a researcher, nice, interesting properties you can prove, but most of us don't really need it. So, 55 minutes from now, in fact, I was giving this at a conference which had a very tight schedule. I'll probably be speaking a bit slower today, so maybe that should be 65 or 75 minutes from now. You should know what to do in about 99% of the situations you'll run into as developers. You should know where some of the common mistakes are so that you can avoid them. And you should also know when you're doing something which is sufficiently unusual that you should talk to a cryptographer and say, so I'm doing this weird thing here, what problems should I run into or avoid running into? So that's why I'm giving this talk. Now, why cryptography in the first place? Well, it will protect us against some attacks, but it's not going to protect us against all attacks. Obviously, if you heard about the Heartbleed bug, that was a bug in a crypto library, but it was not actually a crypto bug. It was just a dumb protocol parsing bug. They got a packet and they extracted the fields from that packet, and they didn't actually validate that those fields made sense. So the traditional 3 Bs for ways that people avoid dealing with cryptography: you bribe the guy who has access to the data, or you break into his office, or you find that he's cheating on his wife and then you blackmail him. In the 21st century, there's really a 4th B, watch out, obey. If you're the US government and somebody's got some information you need, you just sit him down there, torture him, and he'll give you the keys. Now, the reason that cryptography matters is attacking people is usually a lot more expensive than attacking data. It's also more dangerous than attacking data. As we've seen from Guantanamo Bay, well, people hold press conferences to complain that they've been tortured. Your bits aren't going to do that. If someone intercepts your data going over some fiber optic cable, you're not going to know that it's been intercepted. then the NSA can spend as long as they like chewing on the data. If there's any Star Trek fans here, I'm talking about information, not the android. So the purpose of cryptography is to force the US government to torture you. You want to make sure that this is the only way they can get your information. And hopefully they'll decide your information isn't actually so important that they need to torture you. They'll decide, well, okay, in that case you can just keep your secrets. We don't care that much. So cryptography is here to make it more expensive and more dangerous to get your data. It's not going to protect you if the US government really, really, really cares. So, what is cryptography? What does it do for us? Well, there's three things that it. You can encrypt data, which makes it hard for people to read it. You can authenticate data, and you can prove who you are. So, encryption, your data is going out over the wire somewhere, over a fiber optic cable, on a floppy disk that someone might steal. I guess we don't have floppy disks, on a USB key that someone might steal. You can see how old I am. You want to make sure that someone doesn't get access to it and read your plain text. Authentication, somebody has access to your data, maybe they can steal that USB key and put it back without you noticing, or they can intercept your email and stop your original packets from reaching the server, but then send in their own in the place. They're going to modify your data, but you want to make sure that you can detect the modification and then reject the illegitimate data. And then identification, someone comes along and wants to pretend that they are you, and you want to make sure that you can actually prove that you are yourself. Sometimes these last two will be combined together, so when I sign an email message, it is signed with a GPG key that people know refers to me, that I'm the person who owns that key, and so it doesn't just prove that the email hasn't been modified, but it also proves that it hasn't been modified since I personally wrote that message. And in most cases, you're going to want to take two or more different cryptographic components and put them together. There's a number of reasons for doing this. Both, you often will want to have your data both encrypted to keep it secure from attackers, but also authenticated to stop someone handling it. In some cases, you'll want to combine two different encryption schemes because asymmetric schemes let you do more interesting things, but they are also a lot slower. So, the language I'm going to be using for the rest of this talk. Plain text is the data that we actually care about. If you forget about security and cryptography, plain text is what you're actually dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Ciphertext is what we do after, it's what we have after we've added the cryptography to it. It's what we send over the wire, it's what we put onto a USB disk that someone might steal. So it's the information that evil people might get to see and potentially mangle as well. You have keys which are used to convert between the two of them. Sometimes you'll have several different keys. Symmetric is if you have one key which is used for going in both directions between plain text and ciphertext. Asymmetric is when the two directions are different. And you'll hear me talk about ideal cryptographic components. These are sort of theoretical ideas. If things worked perfectly, this is what they would behave like. In practice, nothing is an ideal cryptographic component, but usually if you can prove that something behaves in a way which is not ideal, or if you can distinguish it from something that behaves ideally, then we consider it to be broken, because cryptographers are very paranoid people. As soon as we have the slightest hint that something might not be perfect, we're going to move on to the next option. So for instance, with AES, or any block cipher, if you can provide an attack that distinguishes between encrypted data and a random string of bits, then we consider it to be broken, because a perfect block cipher will just look like a random string of bits. So the first and most basic, probably most important cryptographic component is a hash function. An ideal hash function will take any length inputs, it will give you fixed length outputs, And it has these two properties, collision resistance and being one-way. Collision resistance means it's hard to find two things that collide. So two different inputs, run them both through the hash function, you get the same output. If you can do that without spending some astronomical amount of CPU time on it, then this is considered to be a broken hash function. One-wayness, which is often more important, but not always, is if you have a hash, it's really hard to find something which has that hash. For, say, signing documents, you would normally take the document, run it through a hash function, and then give somebody, this is the hash of the file, the hash of the document. If you see a file that has this hash, it is the real file. If somebody could find a one-way attack on a hash function, they could construct a different file that had that same hash and then present it, and it would be accepted as being legitimate. A collision attack would let someone produce two different files which had the same hash, and then they could say to someone, look at this file, you agree that it is a good file, so please publish a message to all your friends saying this file is, a file with this hash is good, and then you slip in that other file that has the same hash. People then accept it as being legitimate. The important thing here is nothing else is guaranteed except these two properties. And in particular, if you know the hash of one function, somebody might be able to compute a hash of a different function a hash of the same function of different values. And with many hash functions, MD5, SHA-256 for instance, there are so-called related key attacks, or related content attacks, where knowing the hash of a value x can let you come up with a value y, which you don't actually know what it is, except it's x plus some other stuff, and then know what the hash of y is. So you need to think very carefully if you're using hash functions about what you actually know about the hash, which is these two properties, and don't just assume other things like, well, it's a magical mixing function that mashes everything together. Because it isn't magic, it just has these two properties. So if you want to hash something, well, first obviously think about what actually a hash function does for you. The function you should use, SHA-256. Throughout this talk, you will see a lot of do's and don'ts, and also avoids and don't even dream ofs. SHA-256 is a fairly old hash function now. It's been well analyzed. About 7 or 8 years ago, there was some concern that SHA-256, in fact the entire SHA-2 family, might be vulnerable to some new attacks that were coming out of China. Those attacks broke MD5 and SHA-1, but those attacks, at least in the public knowledge, as far as published papers go, have not been extended to SHA-256, so I'm fairly comfortable with recommending SHA-256 still at this point. 4 years ago, I said consider switching to SHA-3 when it was published. Well, it has now been published. It is a very nice hash function. It is very fast. It is not very good for crypto coins, if any of you are wondering, because it's very easy to implement in ASICs. But it's a good hash function. At the same time, I said here, next 5 to 10 years, consider switching over to it. I would still say in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe consider switching over to it, because SHA-256 is really doing very well at this point in terms of not having new attacks, finding any weaknesses in it. But SHA-3 does have some theoretical advantages in terms of performance, so it's very much a case of once it's been looked at more, once we're more confident about it, maybe then you want to switch over to it. You want to use a hash when you can securely distribute the hash value, and you want to validate that some message which is being sent is in fact the message that you hashed. This is pretty much the only time you want to use a hash function. MD2, MD4, MD5, SHA-1, LegMD, these are all broken. You don't want to use them. Actually, no, MD2 is not broken, it's just incredibly slow. You don't want to use it either. SHA-256 is more secure and not broken, and then faster. So you don't want to use those. Also, I was giving this talk first at a BSD conference, which is why I use FreeBSD as an example here. You don't want to put an ISO image and check some file onto the same FTP server, and then think you're actually accomplishing something as far as security goes. Because if someone can break into the FTP mirror that people are accessing and tamper with the ISO image, well, they can also tamper with that checksum file. After I gave this talk, actually, someone came up to me and said, well, the reason we do this, it isn't for security, it's because we used to have problems with a flaky network interface chip, and some of the bits were getting mangled, and so these files were being used by the mirrors to validate if they had downloaded data correctly. That's fine. You don't actually need a hash function for that, you just need a checksum. And finally, you don't want to use a hash function as a symmetric signature. This is what Flickr did. A signature has far more detailed properties than a hash function. So if you need a signature, then you move on to the next slide. We have these things called message authentication codes. An ideal message authentication code takes a key and a value. It maps that value of arbitrary length to an n-bit output, and it is really expensive for an attacker to find any pair of message and message authentication code which is valid, assuming they don't know the key. Even if you give them arbitrary other messages. So in the case of Flickr, someone could take a signed Flickr API call, take that signature, mangle it, and produce a valid signature for a different API call. You can't do that with a message authentication code because there's no way to take one message and authentication code pair and to turn that into another validly authenticated message. We sometimes call these random functions. Sometimes we call them random oracles. Again, this is related to the idealness property that you can't distinguish this from, in fact, something which is truly random. As I said, you can't use the knowledge of one authentication code to use another one, and Flickr just did it wrong. So you want a symmetric authentication code, use HMAC SHA-256. SHA-256 is a very simple, well-understood, very secure building block, and HMAC is a very simple way of taking a hash function and turning it into a message authentication code. In future, if you're using SHA-3, you could use HMAC SHA-3. In fact, SHA-3 has some extra tweaks that can be used to turn it into a message authentication code. But if you're going to do that, then read the documentation very carefully, because you do need to use SHA-3 correctly if you're going to be doing that. Make sure that you never have two different messages which can result in the same data being input. This is what Amazon did wrong, and Flickr also did it wrong. What they did in that case, they were trying to sign messages which consisted of key value pairs. So foo equals 1, bar equals 2, as equals 3. And they did this by just sort of squishing everything together, removing the equals and putting everything into a single string, so that foo equals 1, bar equals 2 turned into the same message that they were signing as foo equals 1, bar 2, because the equals signs were being removed and the fact that it was two different key value pairs were being removed. CBC MAC is popular in some quarters. This is a message authentication code which is based on a block cipher. I recommend avoiding this because block ciphers have some interesting quirks to them. They are more vulnerable to side channel attacks, for instance. Also, they're actually not any faster. So there's no point really going with CBC MAC, except in very rare cases, like if you're working on an ASIC and you only have a very small die area to play with, and you already know you're going to need an AES core, then maybe in that case it's worth doing this to avoid having an extra SHA-256 circuit. But almost always you want to avoid using CBC MAC. Poly 1305. How many people here recognize that name? Okay, one person back there, another person, okay. So this is something that Dan Bernstein came up with maybe about 7 or 8 years ago. It is a very interesting message authentication code. It is actually a very secure message authentication code. He's proven some very interesting properties to it. If your name is Dan Bernstein, then go ahead and use this. Problem is, Dan Bernstein is very good at coming up with things that he is able to do, and nobody else will ever be able to write code like that. If you've looked at the code for Qmail or DJB DNS, you will know what I'm talking about here. He writes very interesting code. Let's just leave it at that. And finally, you want to make sure that you don't leak information through side channels when you're verifying a signature. This was back to the keys are problem. So, side channel attacks, like I mentioned. What is a side channel? It's a way that an attacker can get information other than the ciphertext. The attacker always has the ciphertext. That's just assumed. And in many cases, you assume also that the attacker can get valid plaintext ciphertext pairs. So they convince you to go. They send you some message that they know you're going to forward to somebody else. So then, by intercepting that message, they can produce a chosen plaintext ciphertext pair. But a side channel is something that goes outside of cryptography that deals with the actual implementation. So cryptographers like to think about the rules being ideal. We have these wonderful mathematical objects and a black box that does the cryptography. Unfortunately, the world is not black boxes. You can sometimes see inside them by measuring time or measuring heat or looking at which data got displaced from your L1 cache. Side channels are all these other ways outside of the theoretical mathematical properties. The most common side channel attack is timing. You look at how long it takes someone to perform an operation. But tempest attacks, people may have heard of. These are famous for letting people read CRT screens from a few blocks away by picking up the electromagnetic emissions from those CRTs. Power consumption is a common attack on particularly smart cards. Microarchitectural features I mentioned with Intel CPUs on hyperthreading. This can also apply for non-hyperthreaded CPU, by the way. L2 cache collisions I have seen talked about on some AMD CPUs. If you're going to be giving someone physical access to your systems, you really want to talk to a cryptographer about this. Smart cards, pretty much every smart card out there has been broken because of either side channels or some related fault attacks on smart cards. If you're working in software, which is what I do, I have computers that I run my code on. I assume that those computers are being kept secure either by the owner of the laptop or the server farm where that server is located in. So I generally don't worry about attacks that involve physical access. Also, usually, if someone has physical access to a system that's running general purpose software, they can do other things like flash an BIOS or just insert a keylogger. But if you're dealing with smart cards, those are designed to go into the hands of people who will then be using them to get access to a transit system, whatever. And you know, if you were running a system that controls access to your transit system, then someone will come along and say, I don't want to pay transit fares, I will just mangle this card in a way that lets me put $1 million balance onto it, or something like that. I don't think the transit systems are actually vulnerable to these attacks, so I don't think they use smart cards. But certainly there are other systems that have been attacked that way. If you're going to be having people running code on the same physical machine as you, virtualized systems, you really want to talk to a cryptographer and think carefully about what that other person on that same machine can do. Again, there's the issue I mentioned about cache collisions, but there are also more subtle attacks. You could say you use up all of the bandwidth in a multiplier core of the CPU, and then if someone starts doing their own multiplies, then your multiplies start taking longer because you're competing for access to that core. So there's, anytime you're sharing your resource with someone, what they do could impact what you do, and what you do could impact them in a way that they can then measure and find out what you're doing. If you're planning on releasing a new CPU, if there's anybody from Intel here, please talk to a cryptographer if you're going to be leaking information in new and exciting ways. I think most cryptographers back in 2003 or so were very aware of side channel attacks. Intel didn't seem to think this was a problem, but yeah, it would be nice if people had actually checked first. And most importantly, if you're doing anything with sensitive information or cryptographic keys, make sure you don't leak information based on how long it takes your code to run. And for people who are just dealing with software, this is where almost everybody goes wrong. You want to avoid any table lookups which are dependent on your keys or your plaintext. On systems in the 70s, this wasn't a problem because you were accessing some data in memory and the request went out over the memory bus, and then 200 CPU cycles later or so, you get that data back. Modern CPUs, you have the L1 cache, you have the L2 cache, you have the L3 cache, you've got the translation look-aside buffer, you've probably got the level 2 translation look-aside buffer, you have probably got victim caches for all of those. There are lots of ways that a memory access may be faster at one moment and slower at a different moment. And if there's any way that it can be faster or slower, then there's probably some way that someone can get information based on whether it is faster or slower. You really want to avoid having any key or plaintext dependent branches, because if you're doing two different things based on whether the bit is 1 or the bit is 0, doing two different things is going to take different amounts of time. One of the first side channel attacks against an RSA implementation used this. It was relying on the way that people do modular exponentiation. You take a value and you keep on squaring it, and then you occasionally multiply by the base that you're exponentiating. And they could measure how many bits were won based on how many times you had to do that extra multiply. This actually has two problems, both that one and also if you have any data dependent or plaintext, any key or plaintext dependent branches, you on modern CPUs will run into branch prediction, and somebody else on the same system, possibly even not on the same system, can measure the state of the branch prediction tables inside the CPU and figure out, are you always taking that branch, are you never taking that branch, are you taking it every second time, things like that. Don't even dream about doing this. This is the Google Keysar bug, and it is one of the most common bugs that people write in crypto code. You want to validate that a message authentication code is correct. You go through byte by byte. Does this match? Does this match? Does this match? Oh, this one didn't match. I'll exit the loop now. Well, how long does this take? The number of iterations of that loop is equal to the number of bytes that were correct, plus 1. So, if someone's doing this and you can measure how long it takes, which is pretty easy, you just make a request and you measure how long it takes to get an answer back, an answer which is either, yes, here's your data, or no, go away, you signed that wrong. Then you just go through 256 different first bytes, and one of those requests is going to take longer because it went through this loop an extra time. Once you've got the first byte, you go on to the second byte. 256 attempts. You figure out which one of those takes longer. That meant it went off to the third byte. Takes, for a 256-bit hash, you're looking at 4,000 requests. That's fairly easy to do. Hammer a server for a few seconds. You manage to sign a valid, authentic request without ever knowing the key involved. This is what you want to do. Go through the entire length of the hash, subtract the 2 bytes, and OR that all into a single byte. If anything didn't match, then at the end of this, that byte is going to be something non-zero. And although I said above, don't ever have data-dependent branches, that last one is perfectly valid because you're already telling people what the answer is going to be there. It's either yes or no. So that's hashing, side channels, symmetric authentication. Now let's actually keep things secret. So we want to encrypt data. Usually we're going to be doing this using block ciphers. An ideal block cipher, you have fixed size inputs. Hashes, you can hash an arbitrary amount of data. Ciphers, you're usually dealing with a fixed size block. And you want to convert that to a fixed size output in a way that, well, really, you could give people an arbitrary set of plain text and ciphertext pairs. You can even have them produce plain text and ask you, please encrypt this for me. And they will not be able to generate any other encrypted pair. We sometimes call it a random permutation. I mentioned before, hashes are random functions. These are random permutations. Important difference there with a block cipher, it has to be a permutation, because otherwise you would have two different values which hash to the same value, and you wouldn't be able to reverse it to figure out which value it came from. Usually all we care about is that with the same key, you can't get any information about what one value encrypts to based on what other values encrypt to with that same key. But there are things called related key attacks, where based on how data encrypts using a different key, you can gain information about how it will encrypt with a particular key. And if anybody's been following the stages of AES, there was a related key attack on AES 5 or 6 years ago. I think it only affected AES 256 because the cost was very high. Block ciphers, you should use AES 256. I mentioned there is this related key attack, but it's not going to weaken AES 256 enough to matter. I think it took the cost of breaking down to 240 operations. That's still enough to boil the Earth, not just the Earth's oceans, but actually boil the Earth using the theoretical, quantum mechanical, most efficient possible computation. Nobody's actually going to perform that attack. Theoretically, AES 128 is going to be strong enough. 128 bits of security is enough for any sort of brute force attack to be completely infeasible. Not on the boil the Earth scale, but on the boil the Earth's oceans scale for the amount of power needed. But block ciphers are a bit tricky. They often do have side channel attacks. Yes, there have been several different side channel attacks with table lookups and other issues with them. So, although I don't often say this, I'm worried enough about implementations of AES that I want to have the extra bits of security just in case some of them leak. And if you have looked at the types of attacks that have been made against AES implementations, they usually leak some bits of the key, but not all of the bits of the key. So this idea of have twice as many bits as we need in case half of them got lost is actually quite valid. Don't use Blowfish. I run an online data backup service, and I often look at what other online data backup services are using. And a few years back, I came across one that proudly advertised on their website, we use 448-bit encryption. I just groaned at that because there is only one cipher out there that uses 448 bits, and that is Blowfish. Blowfish actually uses anywhere from 64 up to 448 bits. And obviously they just wanted to go to the highest security level that it supported. Problem is that Blowfish is really broken. It uses 64-bit blocks, which means if you can get someone to encrypt 4 billion blocks, you'll probably get a collision. They will write into the same block again. Anything with that small block size. Is this...
I'll get rid of that.
It just keeps on popping up.
Just keep tweaking before, but...
Okay.
Can you tell us if
you'll go with
VPN is secure?
When I was setting up my laptop to come here, I didn't realize there was a laptop here with my slides on it already. I actually turned off the Wi-Fi just in case. So anyway, don't use Blowfish. It has a very small block size, which makes it vulnerable to all sorts of attacks if you deal with a large amount of data, which these days 4 gigabytes isn't actually all that much data. Blowfish was designed to be a drop-in replacement for DES, which is why it uses a small block size. Now this is correct. Okay. So yeah, don't use DES. It was broken about 20 years ago. If you're using it now, there's something wrong with you. Triple DES is sort of theoretically okay, just about. It's also really slow. For a while, people were using it in US government systems because it was certified and AES wasn't out yet. Or they were building their systems before AES was out, but these days there's no excuse for using triple DES. And don't try to use block cipher mode just as is. You will always want to use it in, almost always want to use it in an established mode of operation. So, modes of operation. A block cipher mode of operation tells you how to use a block cipher, which works on fixed length data, and use it to encrypt a stream of data. Usually, well, a stream, you might have all the data all at once, but it is an arbitrary length. But this also allows you to work in situations where you don't have all the data all at once, so you're, say, reading a large file from disk, you encrypt it as you go, as you send it out over the network. Most block ciphers need you to pad to a multiple of the block size. So AES works with 16-byte blocks. So most of these you will end up with ciphertext, which is a multiple of 16 bytes. The block cipher mode of operation will tell you how to do this padding. It's not quite as simple as you might think. You can't just pad it with zeros because you wouldn't be able to tell whether the data was actually ending with zeros, or if it was shorter, and you could just pad it into that length. There's a whole bunch of modes of operation. They have lots of short initializations, usually 3 letters, sometimes 4 letters. ECB is electronic codebook, CBC is cipher block chaining, CFB is cipher feedback. Yeah, cipher feedback, I think. I can't even remember what all the rest are. Don't ask me to expand all of them. One of them, at least, I know isn't actually an abbreviation. They just wanted to use, they just picked 3 letters because everything else was 3 letters, so they wanted to be consistent. I think that might have been EAX, but I'm not sure. Most of these only provide encryption. Some of them also provide authentication. If you want to encrypt data, use CTR mode. This is also known as counter mode. This is very fast because you encrypt each block individually and then XOR with your plaintext data, which allows you to do things like pipelining on modern CPUs. It is also the most theoretically secure system. I won't go into the mathematical details. Anyway, this is what you want to use. There are modes out there that provide both encryption and authentication. You can use these, I do not recommend it. Thomas Tacek disagrees with me very vehemently here. His view is that you should always use modes which provide encryption and authentication because he doesn't trust that anybody can actually combine encryption and authentication and do it correctly. I take a slightly more charitable view of developers. Also, I take a less charitable view of people who write crypto libraries because I have looked at the OpenSSL source code, and I really don't trust anything which is in the OpenSSL source code. Don't even dream about using ECB mode. If you've looked at the Wikipedia page for block cipher modes of operation, you may be familiar with the penguin on there. This is a very famous example of why ECB mode is a problem. They have a bitmap of a penguin, and they encrypt it using ECB mode, and all the colors are wrong, but you can still see it is a penguin. You don't really want to be advertising to the world that you are sending penguins around. Almost always, you will want to have message authentication code, as well as encrypting your data. Some very, very rare situations where you want to keep your data secure, you want to keep your data private, but you don't care about making sure it's authentic. As I say, very, very, very rare. Unless you really know what you're doing, you want to have some message authentication code added. And in those situations, talk to a cryptographer and he'll probably tell you that you are actually wrong. You do want that message authentication code anyway. When you have received data which is encrypted and authenticated, check the authenticity before you try to decrypt it. So that message authentication code, you will want to compute what it should be, make sure you have the correct value there, before you look at the rest of the data, before you try to run it through your AES block cipher. And I didn't put it on there. The reason for doing this is, I mentioned before, block ciphers often have side channel attacks to them. You don't want to expose data to a block cipher until you validated it, until you know it's not some malicious data that someone put in there. Theoretically, you're in a perfect world, no side channel attacks, you don't need to worry about this. But in a real world, dealing with real world attacks on crypto systems, if you can authenticate data before dealing with anything potentially dangerous, you want to do that. So that was all symmetric. Let's move on to asymmetric. You have a signing key, you have a verification key. I mentioned at the beginning, asymmetric cryptography is where you have two different keys who are going in different directions. The verification key, it will either give you the original data back, or it will say, this is not correctly signed. It is never going to do anything else. It is either, here's the data, or error, do not trust this. If you have the verification key, you cannot compute the signing key. You wouldn't want to be able to do that. This is for situations like you are publishing some software, you attach a GPG signature of the software. People need to have the verification key, your GPG public key, in order to verify that the software hasn't been tampered with, but obviously you don't want people to then be able to create their own software, their own signatures, and pretend that it is the legitimate software that you shipped. This is why you need asymmetric cryptography for things like publishing software. On the other hand, if you have a signing key, you can usually compute a verification key for it. There are some very obscure crypto systems where this isn't the case, but for practical purposes, if you can sign something, you can verify that the signature is correct. The ciphertext is usually the plain text plus a signature. Not always. It doesn't really matter, because if it isn't, then you can just send the plain text as another file that's on the same server if you need to. An asymmetric authentication scheme is broken if somebody can generate any valid ciphertext, any valid signature on Pi, even if they can convince you to sign other messages. This was a very common problem with early implementations of RSA before people figured out how to use RSA properly. You could take a message, someone to sign it, it looks legitimate to them for whatever reason, and then convert that message and that signature into a different message and a different signature in a way that might be dangerous, depending on what was being done with it and what exactly you put in that message that was signed. And I say, sign arbitrary other plain texts. This might be if you can get someone to sign 1 million messages for you that you provide him. It doesn't have to be just one message. So if you can get someone, someone's willing to spend all day signing messages, just whatever you put in front of him, he'll sign it. If you can get a signature on anything that you did not present to him, then this is broken. So you want to have an asymmetric signature, use RSA, SSA, PSS, lots of letters. It's RSA signing with the probabilistic signature scheme padding. RSA, you will hear about lots of different padding methods. This is essentially how you deal with the problem that I mentioned a moment ago of early RSA implementations. Padding is how you change it from being this wonderful mathematical construct to something that's actually usable and actually provides you with some security. You probably want to have a 2 kilobit RSA key, public exponent of 65,536, that's 2 to the 16 plus 1, and use SHA-256. A 2 kilobit RSA key is secure. Some people want to use 4 kilobit keys. It doesn't really buy them anything in terms of current computer systems or computer systems that the NSA is likely to have in the next 30 years. If you want to keep your data secure for the US government for more than 30 years, it's more likely that someone's going to break into your home and steal the data that the US government is going to care enough in 30 years to spend $1 billion to crack your key anyway. The public exponent of 2 to the 16 plus 1, you can use RSA with an exponent of 3. Theoretically, it is secure. A lot of the side channel attacks over the past few years, over the past decade actually, have been a lot easier with small public keys. The attack that I found on RSA with using hyperthreading, using a public exponent of 2 to the 16 plus 1, made that attack about 1 billion times more expensive than if you had a public exponent of 3. So, yeah, having that large public exponent, and this is, there's really just those two options. You either use 3 or you use 2 to the 16 plus 1. The large exponent helps in case something else goes wrong, and that's really what security is all about. You want to have multiple layers of defense so that if something goes wrong, there's still other reasons that you're going to be secure. At SHA-256, almost always you don't want to directly sign data using an asymmetric scheme. You want to sign the hash of the data. So you want to start by reducing it to a 256-bit value. PKCS version 1.5. This was one of the padding methods that was first introduced. It's sort of okay in some situations, but don't use it. RSA, SSA, PSS is provably secure. It is just as fast. Just use that and you're not going to go wrong. PKCS, you need to worry about some edge cases. Don't even dream about using RSA without message padding. Again, people did this for a while and it went very wrong. DSA, this is the data signature algorithm, yes. Yeah, the US data signature algorithm, published by the NSA, might be one reason to avoid it. No, actually, it's sort of okay. It relies on a different crypto system, but there are some good reasons to think that it's secure, except that the original version was limited to 80 bits of strength. There are versions of DSA which go to higher strengths, of course. It's sort of okay. It hasn't received as much analysis as RSA. So the way I see it, unless you're in certain specialized situations, for instance, if you need very small signatures, then you might want to consider DSA. But for most purposes, there's no real reason to go to DSA. RSA will do very well for you. Same thing with elliptic curves. Bitcoin, of course, very famously uses elliptic curve signatures. They have some advantages. They are very small. You can implement them in smaller circuits. If you're working with embedded devices, you can implement them using less power on embedded devices. But they haven't been around for as long. They haven't been analyzed for as long. Some of the popular ways of doing them with 2 to the n bit elliptic curves have been broken. So you need to be very careful to make sure you're using one of the correct elliptic curves. There's really, for most purposes, no reason to go to elliptic curves. Again, specialized situations, you need specialized crypto systems, but for general purpose software, RSA is all you need. Do not ever use the same RSA key for authentication and encryption. This was an option on some early versions of PGP and GPG. Problem here is somebody sends you a message and it looks like it's encrypted, and then you decrypt that message, and if you use the same key, then decrypting the message is the same as signing the message. Then they steal your hard drive and they've got a screenshot of the message that they sent you. It's just, there's too many ways to go wrong if you try to use the same key for authentication and encryption. It's possible, but don't do it. Have two different keys. It's not as if 2,000 bits is going to fill up your hard drive. So, the flip side of things, asymmetric encryption, yeah, it's like signing, except the other way around. You need the private key in order to convert plain text into ciphertext. You need the public key to convert plain text into ciphertext. You need the private key to convert the ciphertext back into plain text. If an attacker can decrypt any ciphertext that he has not asked you to decrypt for him, then it is considered to be broken. So he can present you with messages all day long and say, please decrypt this for me. But if he can then use all of the decryptions you've done for him to decrypt some other message, then this is broken. Usually, there's a fairly low limit on the size of message that you can encrypt, because, well, in the case of RSA 2048, you're dealing with arithmetic over, well, it's modulo in 2048-bit time, so anything more than 2048 bits is just going to get washed away in the modulo arithmetic. So usually what you're going to be doing here is using a block cipher to encrypt the message and then encrypting the key that you used and sending that along with it. So on the decryption side, someone will then decrypt the encryption key, and then once they've got that, then they decrypt all the rest of the message. RSA ES-OAEP, that's RSA encryption scheme with optimal asymmetric encryption padding. This is a NIST standard just like the other one. This is the way to go. It is theoretically secure, it is secure in practice as well. 2048 bits is what you need for security. Again, a nice large public exponent. I should say, actually, one of the reasons that people sometimes use a public exponent of 3 is because it does make the public key operation faster. The time it takes to do this is proportional to the logarithm of the public exponent. So going up to 64K is going to make the public key operation about 8 times slower. In general, this is not going to be a problem. And if you care that much about performance, then you probably want to switch to something more obscure anyway. You want to use SHA-256 and MGF1 SHA-256. These are used for padding the message. I'll skip the technical details, but just like on the signing side, you need to pad the message so that you're not just working with raw RSA. Again, PKCS version 1.5 is bad, so don't use it. Again, don't use RSA without message padding. And almost always, as I said, you will want to generate a random key and then use symmetric encryption using that key, and then encrypt your symmetric key with your asymmetric key and then send that along. RSA OAEP is a very easy place to have timing side channels. And these are bad because you're working with a private key. It can reveal information about your private key. If you read the NIST standard that these come from, I can't remember the number offhand, but if you just Google OAEP, you'll find it. It actually says in very explicit detail, this is somewhere you need to be careful about not having timing side channels. Just follow the instructions, read the standard very carefully, and do what it says. Passwords. We all use them, we all hate them, we often forget them. We use them for a lot of things. Identification, you're logging into a system, you want to prove that you are you. You can also use them for encryption or authentication of data. If you can avoid using passwords, avoid using passwords. People forget passwords. People don't remember strong passwords. There was a study done by Microsoft. They got people to install a browser plugin that recorded the strength of all the passwords they were using on different websites. They found that for most sites like Facebook or LinkedIn, people were using passwords that had about 40 bits of security. 40 bits is not very much. On some sites that had strong password strength requirements, Microsoft's developer network was one of the best ones. They got up to an average strength of about 64 bits. 64 bits is still not very much. 64-bit cryptography, symmetric key cryptography, was broken, I think, in the late 90s was the first time. That is not going to keep anything very secure. But you need, if people are going to try to log into systems, they need something. So passwords are better than nothing, but if you can avoid using them, if you can give someone an RSA fob or whatever, use something else. As soon as you have a password, you want to convert it into a cryptographic key. So you hash the password, and when I say hash, I don't mean using SHA-256. I mean using an actual key derivation function. How many people here remember the LinkedIn password issue a few years back? Was it a few years? Yeah, I think so. Okay, so LinkedIn stored MD5s of all the passwords that people had. So they had a big database that had username or user email address and MD5 of your password. Well, MD5 is very, very cheap to compute. Even on a CPU, you can compute MD5 in a few hundred clock cycles. On a custom-designed ASIC, you can use a few square millimeters and compute it in a few microseconds at most. And you can build a chip that has like 10,000 of these password cracking circuits on it. Not surprisingly, a lot of these passwords people had used for LinkedIn then got cracked because you take lots of CPUs, or a GPU can compute these very quickly, or some people with ASICs maybe. In combination with the fact that people don't have very secure passwords in the first place, it is very cheap to just go through all the possible passwords. You assume people are picking bad passwords, and you go through basically in the dictionary, and then you start adding digits here and there and a few special characters. If you want, just try all 95 ASCII printable characters for passwords of up to 6 characters. With MD5, you can do that pretty cheaply. So you're going to want to use an actual key derivation function. PPK MDF2 is sort of the buzzword compliant option. This is the NIST standard. It's not bad. The way this works is you have a hash function like SHA-256, and you just run it over and over again. Say 10,000 iterations, 50,000 iterations. If you do this, then somebody coming along later who wants to crack your password database that they have somehow stolen, because it seems that all these databases eventually get stolen by someone at some point. If you hash the value repeatedly, it just takes that much longer. So instead of taking a few months, it might take 10,000 months to compute the same number of cracked passwords. The more secure option is scrypt. I came up with this back in 2009, I think it was. I was working on TarSnap. So a bit of background, TarSnap, I mentioned before, avoid using passwords. So in order to access the TarSnap service, you have a key file which has cryptographic keys, 256 bits of strength, which are used for everything. But people want to add some password-based security to this so that if the disk that had the keys on it got stolen, they wouldn't be immediately in trouble. So what I did is I was looking at ways that you could use passwords, passphrases, even to encrypt data, and the problem it comes down to is having the most secure key derivation function, which means essentially the function which is the most expensive for an attacker to compute. MD5 is really bad, PPKDF2 is a lot better. Scrypt is designed to not just take a lot of CPU time, like PPKDF2 does, iterating the hash function 10,000 times, for instance, but it also uses a lot of memory. And if you're working on an ASIC, an application-specific integrated circuit, memory is expensive because it uses up silicon die area. So this will, in fact, make things quite a bit more expensive for a sophisticated attacker, which, for everything I do, I assume that the NSA is my attacker. I know that the NSA can fabricate application-specific integrated circuits. If you're just worried about some 13-year-old, it's a bit less of a problem. Do not store your user's passwords on your server. The first thing you do when you get a password, you hash it using a good key derivation function. You store that derived key. You throw away the password. You write over the memory with zeros. You should not have that password anymore. Never mind be storing it into your database. And no, not even if they're encrypted. I see people doing this. They say, oh well, I'm using AES to encrypt the passwords before I store them in my database. Well, okay, so your code later on, when someone tries to log in, it takes the key that you have and it decrypts those passwords. Well, that means if someone breaks into your system, then they steal that database and they also steal your key, which means they've now got access to all the passwords. So no, encrypting the passwords is not good enough. You want to hash them. You want to have derived keys so that it is really expensive for someone to then come back to the original passwords. SSL. I said at the beginning, traditional wisdom, you should be using SSL TLS, the newer version of it, for data in transit. SSL is a horrible system. How many people here have read the RFC? Okay, there's one person back there who's read the RFC. The latest version of TLS, I think it's about 150 pages. You do not need 150 pages to specify a secure transport protocol. I'm actually in the process of writing up an RFC for the protocol I use for some other software about S-Pipe-D, and it's about 3 pages long. You need about 3 pages to specify a secure transport protocol. 150 pages is there because they have 20 different ciphers you can use. They have 15 different types of certificates. It's designed in a way that makes it almost impossible to implement securely because the attacker can choose which of these different options he wants to tell you to use. And you're running your server, you're probably going to turn on all of them because if someone wants to connect to you and for whatever reason the only option they support is MD5 and Blowfish and 512-bit RSA, you want to talk to them, right? So you're going to support it. Good protocols do not provide that much flexibility to users because users might be doing dumb things. So yeah, it's no surprise that OpenSSL keeps on having vulnerabilities. Partly it's because the OpenSSL code is really horrible code. It has been written by maybe 50 people over the past 15 years. Very few of them have stuck around for more than about 2 years. They work on it for a while, they get bored, they go off and do something else. Somebody else comes in, can't understand the code, starts making changes to it without actually knowing what they're doing. But part of it is just that SSL is just horribly complex. There's too many ways for people to attack it. And finally, the SSL protocol, it works on the basis of certificate authorities. You decide which certificate authorities will I accept. Somebody gets a certificate from somewhere, usually the cheapest bidder. And if you want to talk to people, if you want to visit websites, you have to support this. Well, do you trust the Chinese government? Hands up. How many people here trust the Chinese government? Okay, there's a few people. Most of you don't trust the Chinese government. Well, the Chinese government is actually a certificate authority. The Chinese Ministry of Information is a certificate authority which is accepted in most modern web browsers. Unfortunately, sometimes you're stuck with SSL. If you want to put up a website, you have to use SSL because that's what web browsers support. If you're writing software where your client is talking to your server, that's what I do all the time. You don't need to use SSL because there you're controlling both ends of the conversation. You don't need to worry about someone's web browser and what their web browser supports. So if you are in that situation, don't use SSL. Instead, provide people with the verification key for your chosen asymmetric signature scheme, and then use that to bootstrap your cryptography. Everything I've said here gives you the tools that you need to do things securely. You need to get that key out to people in the first place, which is why we have certificate authorities. But if you're giving people software, you can give people a key at the same time as the software. And if someone can tamper with that key, well, they could have just tampered with their software. So in that situation, you've lost already. So let's deal with the situation that you can do something about, which is you assume at the very beginning you have a secure way of giving people bits, which they're going to run. But again, your website, your email, any other public internet-facing servers, you need to use SSL. So use SSL, but be very careful about it. Personally, I run FreeBSD on all of my servers, and we have a nice feature called jails, which is sort of a virtual machine within FreeBSD. I terminate all of my SSL connections inside jails and then make a plain text connection over the loopback to my web server. This makes sure that when there's a vulnerability in SSL, it is always when, that vulnerability won't be exploited to get any access to the server. All you can do is get access inside that jail. And finally, if you're going to be using SSL, then think carefully about which authorities you want to trust. If you are making API requests to somewhere like Amazon Web Services over SSL, you might want to look at which certificate authority they use, and then set your client to only trust that one authority. That way you don't need to worry about the Chinese government because Amazon doesn't have anything signed by the Chinese government. So that's all things you should be doing in terms of cryptographic primitives, how to use cryptography. Now sometimes you need to do things outside of that, so you will want to talk to a cryptographer if you're going to be working on hardware that attackers have physical access to. So smart cards, if you're doing anything like a smart card, resembling a smart card, anything where you are shipping a device out to users, direct TV antennas, which there's some licensing system on it, I don't know the details, but people keep on claiming it. If you're putting something into the hands of someone you don't trust, you need to talk to a cryptographer. There's a whole separate regime about dealing with physical security and devices which will wipe themselves if they find someone is trying to tamper with them. I'm not the person to talk to about that, and nothing I've said in this talk applies to those situations, really. If you need to use a small amount of power, like dealing with mobile phones, this is why mobile phones have had so many vulnerabilities over the years. People have said, well, yeah, we know that there's these nice secure systems like AES, but we're working on a phone and we've got this tiny battery, and we need to be talking to the base station all day long, and we would rather have 6 hours of battery life than 2 hours of battery life. These days, we have better CPUs, we have embedded AES circuits, so it's less of an issue there, but in general, there are systems which need to use very, very small amounts of power, and there are encryption systems that are designed to work with very small amounts of power and are secure. So if you need one of those, then talk to a cryptographer and get one of those. Don't try to invent your own, because if you do, then you will get it wrong. Cryptographers spend a long time figuring out how to design these systems. And if you get it wrong, then you're going to have 100 million devices out there which do not have any security in them. Alternatively, if you need to process lots of data really, really fast, so if you're building a router that needs to process 10 gigabits per second of IPsec traffic, you might want to think carefully about talking to a cryptographer. They might tell you what particular hash function will work better in the ASICs that you're designing. Again, I do software, I do general purpose software. There are going to be some trade-offs you need to worry about there, but you want to talk to someone who knows and has experience in that particular area if you're dealing with that very unusual circumstance. I think it's unlikely that any of you will ever be designing routers that deal with 10 gigabits per second IPsec traffic, but if you are, talk to a cryptographer. And finally, if you plan on talking to a nuclear submarine, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the systems used for communicating with nuclear submarines, but it is very difficult to do this because salt water is a conductor. It is very effective for shielding any sort of electromagnetic emissions. So typical systems for communicating with nuclear submarines have bandwidth of like 1 bit per 10 seconds. If you want to communicate a message quickly, you usually send a message to the submarine saying, "We have something to tell you, please come up to the surface." Then they come up to the surface, take up an antenna, and then they get gigabits per second. But if you do need to talk to a nuclear submarine while it is underwater, you want to use a small number of bits. Obviously, talking to a nuclear submarine, you want to have some security as well. So there are systems that are designed specifically to be secure with a minimum number of bits. Again, I don't deal with those, but cryptographers can tell you about these. And finally, if you want to ignore anything I've told you, talk to a cryptographer. They might tell you that you're right, but they're probably going to tell you that you're wrong. Any questions? Yes?
Yeah, so you mentioned about generating random keys and encrypting the message with the random keys. So what's the good source for randomness?
So, okay, so the question is, what is the source for randomness if you want to generate random keys for re-encrypting messages or encrypting them using RSA but with a symmetric key first? For general purpose cryptography in software, the source of all randomness is the operating system kernel. So if you're on any sort of Unix, you will open dev random and you will read from there. If you're in Windows, there's get secure data, get secure crypto random, something like that. There's an API call anyway. If you're working in software, there's really nothing you can do on your own to get secure information. It used to be that people would try to do things like ask the user to wave the mouse around and measure the location of the mouse every millisecond and hash all that. It really doesn't work very well. The kernel has far more sources of entropy. It can measure how long does each disk access take. It can measure the exact times of packets coming in over the network. It can measure the skew between different clocks, because most systems will have 2 or more different clocks in them. That is actually comes down to a quantum mechanical property, which is, in a very theoretical sense, real randomness. All these things that the kernel has access to that you as a general purpose software developer don't. So ask the kernel for randomness. In some situations, if you are going to be generating lots of different keys, if you need lots of sources of randomness, you may want to start your program by getting random bits from the kernel and then run them through a cryptographically secure pseudo-random number generator yourself. There are some situations, particularly old versions of Windows, where the kernel randomness is not ideal. So sometimes getting a whole bunch of randomness from the kernel and then mixing it up yourself can be better. Depending on how comfortable you are writing crypto code, how comfortable you are in C for that matter, because it does need to be done in C. You can't use higher level languages like Java, JavaScript. They will leak information all over the place. So either get the information from the kernel every time you want random bits, or at the beginning, and then have a good random number generator you can find independently. Next question. Yes?
Maybe some ideas on maybe another subject that's related with key management. Like, for example, in software, like in a lot of languages, let's just say you have to store the keys. Is there a way to improve prove that, you have some other mechanism, not necessarily embedded in your software to access your
Sorry, I didn't quite hear all that, but the question is about key management and embedding keys in your software.
Yeah. How to do that better?
How to do it better.
So, to tag on to that, something like E3, EC2 keys, or...
Well, no, let's just say that you have software and then you want to, let's say you're creating dynamic instances in a cloud application, right? And then you need to pick your software from somewhere, and then the software will have keys, right? There to connect the database or whatever. Is there a better way of doing it? Is there a way to manage the keys in a way that you don't have to have keys in your software or that kind of thing?
Do you store a key like in the source code already?
Yeah, is there a better way of managing that?
Okay, so the question is, how do you get the keys that you need into the software that needs to use them? I've seen a lot of approaches to this. The first thing I would say is don't put it into your source code, because people do things with source code that might be a problem, like, say, uploading it to GitHub. I've seen a lot of Amazon Web Services keys on GitHub. The way I always deal with it is I will store my keys in a file, and then one of the parameters I pass on the command line to whatever program I'm running is the path to the file that has the key that it needs. And then the program launches, it reads the keys, and then it goes and does everything it needs to do. Some people put them into Unix environment variables. Amazon Web Services on EC2 has this system called roles, where you can fetch them over HTTP from their backend system attached to the EC2 instance. That actually is something I really do not like, because although it does have some nice properties in terms of key rotation automatically being there for you, unless you set up firewall roles very carefully, any software running on that system will be able to access those keys. Now, if you only have one program running on that system, that's not a problem. But if you have multiple different parts of that system, if you set up your privilege separation properly, then someone might be able to break into one system, or one program on that system, but not yet have access to the system which is actually using those keys. But if you use Amazon roles, then they'd be able to access those keys anyway. Okay, there's someone at the back.
I think he's actually asking an earlier question. You have an iOS or Android app, it connects to Twitter, Twitter gives you the secret to sign your API request with, you embed the secret into your iOS or Android app, you distribute your app, your user uses a hex editor and pulls it out.
Okay, so this is a related question, which is how do you write applications that you distribute to your clients, where a million people might be running this code and then using keys to make API requests. The best answer I can give there is give up. It is never going to be secure. People will get your keys if you do that. There are ways that you can work around this, so if you, depending on what exactly is being done with these API keys, you could set up a signing server which you run, and then your application makes requests to your server saying, I want to make this request to Amazon S3 maybe, and here's what I want to do, and then your server sends back the signature that will let them do that, after validating that the request is actually reasonable. But that's about all you can do. If you give people keys, they will get the keys and they'll do whatever they want with those keys. Yes?
For the source of randomness, are you familiar with the Mersenne twister algorithm?
Yes, I'm familiar with the Mersenne twister.
Is that suitable?
I do not recommend using that for anything, really. It became popular about 10 years ago when Richard Brent, who in fact my doctoral supervisor, proved that this system would not repeat before some astronomical number of iterations. That doesn't actually matter. for any cryptographic or even non-cryptographic purpose of a random number generator, how long it takes for it to repeat tells you nothing about the security of it or the effectiveness of it. What matters is if you can see a number of values returned by it, can you predict the next value? The Mersenne Twister does have some security in that way, but it's no more than a huge number of other vastly faster algorithms provide you.
So the way I've used it before is that you have a daemon running it, it just peels numbers off it as fast as it can, even if you're not using them. That's not secure.
So the question here is repeatedly taking information out of the Mersenne Twister and then spitting out the most recent value when you next ask for one?
If you need them, you get whatever's there. If you don't, they're just tossed away. That way it's hard to predict what's next.
Right, so that will add a very small amount of entropy based on when you make the next request, but I mean that's really not enough to provide any degree of security. So, the Mersenne Twister has nice properties, and as long as you only ask for a small number of bits at a time, that was, I think, 32 bits at the bottom is safe, then it will be theoretically secure, but there are many other options based on hash functions, based on block ciphers, which provide just as much security and are about 1 million times faster. So there's just no easy to use in Mersenne Twister. Yes?
Assuming that the tools and the libraries we use have side channel timing attacks, or undiscovered ones as yet, is there anything that we, the developers of general purpose software, can do to add entropy to the system, make it less likely that those attacks could be used?
So the question is, if there are side channel attacks out there which have not been fixed yet, is there anything we can do to mitigate them? Some of the advice I've given here, particularly around block ciphers, is dealing with mitigation, using extra bits of security in block cipher in case you leak some of them, not allowing information from an attacker to reach that block cipher, because that would make it possible to use chosen ciphertext attacks. Because a lot of side channel attacks, you can only exploit them by providing chosen data into them. If you're always inputting the same values into them, 0, 1, 2, 3, then those aren't going to leak the information that an attacker needs. In a more general case, if there's attacks out there that you don't know about, you might not have any way to work against them. People have tried to deal with timing attacks by adding a random amount of extra delay. That doesn't really work very well. There's a famous paper from 1995, I think, called Remote Timing Attacks Are Practical, which showed that even over quite wide latencies, if you did enough attempts, because really you're dealing with statistical properties here, you want to find out if something is faster or slower than something else. If you've got lots of noise, then just try it 1,000 times and take the average amount of time, or in some cases take the smallest amount of time, and you'll wash out any additional latency you get from network or jitter or your CPU speeding up and slowing down because of power consumption or whatever. It's very difficult to add extra time and try to wash out this effect. At best, you make it slower. You mean that you cause the attacker to make more requests, which, if you're really lucky, the attacker will do all the requests all at once, and then you'll notice in your logs, hey, someone's suddenly hitting our server 100,000 times per second. But it's hard to add enough noise that it's not possible for an attacker to carry out a side channel attack if they find one. Yes?
And as far as passwords, I've heard in the past that one way of dealing with password attacks is to store salt with each
Right.
key. Is that necessary if you're using a crypto key, or is it different?
Okay, so the question here is about salting passwords. Yes, you should be using a salt. The purpose of salt in hashing passwords with computer-derived keys is that if you are using the same hash function as everybody else, if you're using the same hash function for every password that you're hashing, then someone can compute once and check against all the different values. So in the case of a database with 1 million passwords in it, they can compute the hash of A, and then they can tell, do any of these 1 million people have the password A? With a salt value, these salts don't need to be private, by the way, they just need to be different for every value, every password that's being hashed. The point here is that you have a salt of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for your password of A, then someone needs to compute what key do we get when we compute the hash of A and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then they can see if that particular password is A, but it doesn't tell them if any of the other passwords in the database are A, because they were computed with different salt values. So the purpose of salt does nothing to make one password harder to crack, and again, it also does nothing to make one file that's encrypted with a key derived from a password harder to crack, but it makes it harder to crack a database with lots of passwords or a large set of files encrypted with different passwords, because it means you need to attack each of them individually.
It also protects against rainbow tables, doesn't it?
And yes, it also protects against rainbow table attacks. Rainbow tables are a method of pre-computation which is essentially the same issue as computing once and checking against lots of different passwords. It's sort of a way of reducing the space you need for a database of hashed passwords. Yes?
There was a talk that Microsoft researcher James Mickens gave a couple months ago, where he had a slide, tongue-in-cheek, laying out 2 threat models. Mossad, not Mossad. Where in one you're totally fucked and give up. How cynical are you in terms of the vulnerabilities we have in cryptography and all the other things we can do wrong, to the level of security that we could possibly reach and how far we should attempt to take it?
So the question is how cynical am I, and I think implicitly, can we actually be secure against nation-state actors? My view is that we, as developers, we can be secure against nation-state actors if we are careful, if we know what we're doing, if we don't try to do anything fancy that we don't understand what we're doing, which a lot of people do. In practice, we're not secure. Almost everything we do online uses OpenSSL. OpenSSL is a horrible piece of software. The NSA, I am sure, is aware of bugs in it. But that's the current state of things. As developers, we can try to make things better. We can try to write secure code. It partly depends on how much code you're using, how much you're exposed to. If you're using 1 million lines of code written by random people around the world, there's going to be bugs in it. There's probably going to be security bugs in it. If you're writing a very small, very simple piece of code, and you're very careful about it, maybe you publish it online and ask for people to review it. Maybe even better, you offer people bounties if they find bugs, it'll give them $1,000. Then you have a real shot at producing 2,000 lines of secure code. Because just reducing the number of lines of code means you're 500 times less likely to have bugs in it. So we can be secure, but most of us aren't secure. I guess is the best answer I can give there.
Yeah. And, go ahead.
Yes? Go ahead.
So people in companies have written like these crypto libraries that are sort of wrapper libraries that wrap other cryptographic functions. You mentioned one, Google's keys are. Are those type of libraries something that you would still recommend, or I mean, do they also have a bunch of flaws that make them impractical to use?
Okay, so the question here is about libraries like Keysar, which wrap around other libraries. Most of those libraries that I've seen are designed for 2 purposes. One is to provide functions to higher level languages like Python or Ruby or Java. And the other is to limit people to only using good cryptographic primitives. That second one I mostly approve of. OpenSSL has all sorts of garbage in it, like it has support for tests, it has support for blowfish, and guiding developers to not use those, it can't hurt. On the other hand, there are some people like Dan Bernstein who produce libraries that don't have support for AES because he thinks AES is a bad block cipher that you shouldn't be using. In the real world, if you want to talk to people, you have to use AES. Even if you're only talking to your own code right now, someday down the road, you're probably going to want to talk to someone else's code, and they are not going to have a library that supports Dan Bernstein's personal choice of block ciphers. So, yeah, there's limits to how far you should go in terms of using a library that tries to prescribe which tools you should be using. On the other side of things, libraries which just provide the basic functionality to higher level languages, well, if you're in those higher level languages, you have to use them. There's no other way to get access to the basic functionality except writing your own shim libraries, and Google's more likely to get it right than you are. Yes? So the question is, what are my thoughts on bcrypt, given I don't like blowfish? Bcrypt has very little connection to blowfish. The name comes from blowfish. It doesn't actually use blowfish internally, it uses a rather mangled version of blowfish. And it doesn't really rely on the security of blowfish, of which there is very little. It uses blowfish as a mechanism for producing an expensive computation, which is essential for a strong key generation function, because you want to have an expensive computation because the guy who's cracking the passwords needs to do something expensive. I should have started by saying, sorry, that bcrypt is a key generation function like PBKDF2 and scrypt. So my thoughts on blowfish, it is effectively equivalent to PBKDF2. It does very different things under the cover, but in terms of the security, it has a customizable work factor, so you tell it how long you want it to work for, and it effectively just iterates a hash function, but it does not use an increasing amount of memory the way that scrypt does. So it has the same disadvantage as PBKDF2, that you can build an ASIC if you're the National Security Agency or a few other governments around the world. You can produce an ASIC which will compute that very fast because you can have lots and lots of circuits all over your ASIC core. I should add, actually, I say National Security Agency or some other government around the world, but we know from the cryptocurrency world that there are companies now building ASICs for SHA-256 and even some coming out for scrypt. So you don't necessarily need to be government to spend a few $1 million and produce an ASIC designed for cracking passwords, which is essentially what crypto coin mining comes down to. Yes?
Working on the assumption that if a software developer is distributing some software that users are going to use, if you can hack the developer's own desktop box, their development box, they've hacked the software as well. What advice do you have for software developers protecting their own boxes? This is stretching away from cryptography itself, but just general security advice for software developers and their boxes.
Right, so the question here is on the assumption that if you can break into a software developer's box, then you can then insert whatever you like into the software that he's writing. What can software developers do? My answer to that is really to deny the assumption at the beginning. Yes, you can insert malicious code into what software developers write, you can get into their systems, but you should have that code published somewhere. Ideally open source code everybody can look at, but even within private companies, other people within the company should be looking at the code. And if there's something odd in that code, they should be looking at it and saying, hey, what did you do here? If someone can break into your computer and insert code that does bad things, that means that you as a developer could insert code that does bad things, which means that somebody who is bribing you or blackmailing you could tell you to do those things. So any smart company will have a code review system which does not rely on trusting every single developer out there.
Great. So with that line of attack out of the way, what about developers' boxes having keys that have access to production things, or other routes to doing nasty?
Okay, so the question is now other ways beyond putting in malicious code, like keys that developers have. I would say developers should never have keys to production systems. You hopefully have experienced DevOps system administrators who set up the systems that run in production. Your developers should have access to test keys and test systems. At this point, it moves away from cryptography and just becomes a general issue of security. And depending on the size of the company, how paranoid you are, how many employees you have, and how much you trust them, there's lots of trade-offs you need to make there. I don't work in a large corporate environment, so I don't have direct experience with those situations. But obviously, you want to give as few privileges to as few people as possible. Yes?
How large should a salt be? And does it have to be random or just unique?
Question is about salts. How large should they be, and do they need to be random or just unique? They need to be large enough that they don't accidentally happen to be the same. They do not need to be random. Even being unique isn't absolutely necessary. It's just that if they are not unique, then you make an attacker's life a little bit easier because you can crack 2 passwords at once. Generally speaking, I would pick them randomly rather than trying to do it deterministically, because if you try to do it deterministically, if you're just counting up from 1, odds are you're going to have a race condition somewhere and you're going to accidentally set the same salt twice.
I'm just thinking, like, typically you have systems like user ID, right? You just have your user ID as a salt.
Can you use a user ID as a salt? Yes, you can use a user ID as a salt. I would recommend not using a user email address as a salt because other companies might be doing that. Also, if the user then changes their email address, then you need to recompute their password hash because the salt has changed. But yeah, you could use an opaque user ID as a salt.
So just like 1, 2, 3, 4 as your users go up, right?
And you could theoretically just use a user number for that. Personally, I always use 256-bit random salts just because 256 bits is cheap to store, cheap to hold in memory, never mind disk, and that just makes sure there's nothing to worry about. You're never going to get collisions. Yeah, you can save a few bits if you want, but really, why bother? There's ways to get it wrong, and it's never going to help you. Yes?
Do you think that quantum computing is a threat to current encryption techniques?
Do I think quantum computing is a threat to current algorithms? Currently, I do not think quantum computing is a threat. I believe that the most advanced quantum computer available recently determined that 15 is equal to 3 times 5 with high probability. Quantum computers, of course, never actually say anything for certain. All they do is work probabilistically. People have been trying to build large quantum computers. D-Wave, of course, is a Vancouver company, and they've made a lot of news with their quite large quantum computers, except that their quantum computers can't work on pretty much any real-world problem out there. They are, mean, there's some interesting toy problems they can work on, but nothing that affects cryptography at least. And actually, I'll talk there. In terms of where quantum computers may go in the future, the most likely placement to attack is RSA or other asymmetric encryption schemes. There are ways to use quantum computers to attack things like hash functions or block ciphers, but they, at best, reduce the search space to the square root. So for AES-256, a wonderful quantum computer that doesn't exist and probably won't exist for another 50 years at least, will reduce it to 128 bits of security, which in fact is plenty. Especially when you realize that quantum computers are not going to be running at 10 gigahertz and being on a tiny die area. So I'm slightly concerned about what a quantum computer 30 years from now might do to RSA. I'm not concerned about what it would do to to hash functions, message authentication codes, or block ciphers. Yes.
A few of your slides mentioned RSA. Using what you do is use RSA as a secure padding feature, but the don't is RSA without the padding. I'm wondering what that padding does and what not having is secure.
Okay, so the question here is about padding on RSA. So RSA in the raw form is just a modulo exponentiation, modulo the public modulus. The padding, there's a few different padding schemes, but they take your message, which is obviously you've already turned it into a series of ones, series of bytes, and then usually they have the properties that they make sure that there are non-zero bytes up to the entire length of the number, rather than being, say, only, if you have a 16-byte message, then that's a small number when you parse this as being a number modulo n. And they also add sort of hard to create patterns of random-ish bits higher up in the message. It's hard to describe without a picture. But the point of it is that when all the ways of manipulating RSA encrypted or RSA signed messages deal with multiplying by values or dividing by values, and they will not give you those patterns of randomish looking bytes at the top of the message. And then when you're decrypting or verifying a signature, you can see if those are there and reject something that's been tampered with before doing anything more with it.
You guys have a couple questions to see says.
Okay, you're someone who thinks a lot, discusses a lot, and you're currently an educator with people on issues of security and cryptography. Do you ever fear persecution? Do you experience persecution? And if so, how do you prepare for that? How do you mitigate it?
So the question here is, given that I'm somebody who speaks and educates about cryptography and security, do I get persecuted? Do I fear persecution? I have never experienced any persecution from government. I don't particularly fear it. Partly, I think that's because I tell people how to write cryptographic code, and I'm not directly writing code and putting it into people's hands. There are some exceptions to that. SPIPE-D, for instance, is a tool I wrote for creating secure pipes between systems. But it's not something which is being used widely. So it's not the sort of thing that would be on the US government's radar, as this is something that different people are going to be using. Beyond that, I would say the worst persecution I've had was back in 2005 coming from Intel, when I started circulating a paper in the computer security community about the flaws in hyperthreading. They got very upset with this. They were clearly worried it would hurt their market share, and they tried to put some pressure on companies that I worked with to ask them to tell me to shut up about it. But I mean, that had nothing to do with security. It was purely a business issue that they didn't want bad publicity. Fortunately, I was not employed at the time, so I didn't have a boss who could tell me to shut up.
Last one here.
You mentioned after any key distribution, a key iteration function to remove the key from memory. You mentioned just zeroing out the key. Is that considered secure, or is there something else we should do to make sure it's actually scrubbed from memory from memory everywhere else?
So the question here is about zeroing passwords from memory. Of course, this also applies to any cryptographic keys that you have used and no longer need. As long as it is actually happening, writing over a buffer with zeros is secure. There have been some attempts to take RAM, which has had value stored in it, and cool it down to very low temperatures, and then extract the bits from it. Theoretically, some of those could retrieve a little bit of remaining charge from the system, even after you've written zeros to it. But I don't think anybody has actually done that. And again, that's getting back to the situation where an attacker has physical access to the machine. And in that situation, there's all sorts of other things to worry about as well. Now, I mentioned that as long as you're actually getting zeros written to those locations in memory. This is a problem with a lot of languages. Higher level languages, of course, interpreted languages, they do all sorts of things behind your back. You have no idea where your password is being stored, where your keys are being stored. Even C, there are some problems because the C language says that a compiler can make whatever optimizations it wants as long as your code gets executed faithfully and produces the right results. So it can say, oh, you're writing zeros over this buffer, but you never access that buffer again. So we'll just optimize out those zeros. It can also do things like saying, well, for performance reasons, you have that buffer over there in memory, but we're going to copy it into the stack and then access the value that's in the stack because the stack might be faster memory. And oh, you say you're casting this pointer to volatile, which means we can't optimize this out because it might get access again later. So we will write the zeros it told us to write, except we will write it to that original buffer, and that stuff in the stack, well, you didn't tell us it was there. We just created it ourselves, so we're just going to leave it there. So in terms of dealing with strictly conforming C, there's no secure way to wipe data from memory. This is a problem. I'm actually talking to a couple compiler developers who are working on fixes for this. Sometime around maybe 2016, we may have a new keyword in C compilers for marking functions, as this function may do sensitive things, don't leave information lying around your memory. But in general, at the current state, it is a problem that there's no